I'm going to ask you.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. So, John, you're back in town?
I am back.
My wife said, boy, he vacations a lot.
Hey, you know, those vacations are proving more and more successful, okay?
It even added to your personal life, right?
I did.
For those of you that don't know, John is engaged now.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kept asking the question, finally found somebody to say yes.
Was he surprised?
Totally.
Was he?
Totally surprised. Nobody else on the ship was surprised because most everybody was in on it except for him.
Really? I'm surprised everybody could keep that secret, right?
There were a couple of the hosts or hostesses that kind of blew it almost, but he didn't catch what they had said, so that was good.
Well, that's exciting. Ruth, when we saw your picture, you're upside down. I'm not sure what's happening there.
I don't know either.
It's kind of distracting.
They're upside down again.
Maybe we're all upside down and she's right side up.
That could be it.
Thank you, John.
Try turning your phone upside down.
I'm using my laptop. Well, I guess I'll just not do video right now.
It's all right, Ruth. It adds to. That's just what can happen in today's world, right?
I guess. Crazy.
It just shows the roots more.
So, John, what did you do with Toby when you were gone this time?
I have a neighbor that pet sits, so I just pay her to
Oh,
take care of him. And she sends me pictures of him playing and her hanging out with him and him sitting there watching her read. So it's cool.
that worked out well. Not taken from home that way.
Yeah. And of course, Jay's trying to figure out how we can make him the ring bearer at the wedding.
Can't wait to see that.
Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Shweta, are you back in the country?
Yes, I'm back.
Are you? Okay. Shweta's
Got
in-
back yesterday.
Oh, you did? Wow.
Yeah. I think my body is still out there. I can't get it to move too much at this point.
I believe that. That's a long trip.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is the first meeting of the year. I hope everybody had a happy new year.
Yes.
Good morning, happy new year.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year again, right? Inventory is exceptionally low. It seems like nothing has changed in terms of competitiveness. One thing that's happening right now, rates seem to be going up. We're seeing more rate increases taking place in the mortgage market. So that may have an impact in terms of the number of competitive bids. But I was just talking to Joyce Lynn this morning. She had a property she listed in Woodbury, sold for, it was listed at 2 million, it sold for 2,150,000. Now she has a like property she listed for 2 million, and that sold for 2,450,000. And she even has an offer above that at 2,500,000. We're talking about how do we address the appraisal issue, because who knows if that's really going to appraise, but just so surprising to see what's happening. And they're selling quickly. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. I don't care how you look at it. So I'm getting a lot of questions about Assembly Bill 1482. And Assembly Bill 1482, excuse me, was effective January 1st of 2020. And the official name of the law is the Tenant Protection Act. So there's been a number of acts that have been put into place during the last couple of years. So a couple of things. AB 1482 is the same as the Tenant Protection Act. And also we sometimes refer to it as the rent cap and just cause eviction law. So the terms, in a sense, refer to the same law. So just keep that in mind if you hear terminology from other individuals. So from March of 2020 through September 30th of 2021, there was a statewide rent moratorium, which was imposed. And it was imposed on all procedures in regards to evictions also. And it was only temporary though. Excuse me. So as of September 30th, 2021, single family properties and new construction built within the last 15 years, among other types of properties, and we'll get into the detail, are now once again, or can be exempted from the statewide just cause rules. And also now landlords can now demand the full amount of rent, whereas before they couldn't. Another thing that was enacted was the Rental Housing Recovery Act, Assembly Bill 832, and that still is in place. And that law generally requires the use of a special 3-day notice to pay rent or quit before a landlord can file an unlawful detainer action. Now, that notice is associated with rents due between October 1st of last year and March 30th of this year. So the landlord can demand, if in the event the tenant is delinquent, the total amount of rent due, the landlord can serve a 3-day notice to pay or quit. However, before the landlord can file an unlawful detainer action for those rents due through March 30th of this year, an additional 20 days is afforded the tenant to obtain rental assistance, or the landlord must demonstrate that they've made the effort to assist the tenant with obtaining rental assistance. So those are other complications that still exist for us. And then keep in mind, for the rents due through September of 2021, if a landlord is actually evicting based upon rents due for that period of time, they can only evict based upon the initial 25% of the rents due. Any monies over and above that during that period of time that are outstanding, it is simply just a civil action. It's not a basis for eviction. So that has not gone away. And then the other benefit that's taking place, before the rental assistance that was provided, it was up to 80% of the outstanding rents. It's not going to include late fees and things like that. But now, assuming the money is there, the rental assistance cover up to 100% of the rents outstanding. So there's some benefits there, and it just takes a while with the state in regards to obtaining the money. I had one tenant, for example, that hadn't paid from April of 2020. And once I finally got them out, I did apply for rental assistance on behalf of the tenant, and I was able to obtain 100% of the money. You know what? Those are your tax dollars that are paying me. I want you to know that. Any comments about that? No smart ass comments yet? Okay. So let's go over a quick summary of the rent cap and just cause eviction law. So rent cap, rent increases, assuming no exemption exists for the landlord. They're capped at 5% plus inflation, or up to a hard cap of 10%, whichever is lower. And then just cause reasons for eviction. There are 15 reasons that are divided into 2 categories. At fault termination of tenancy is generally based upon a tenant's breach of the lease, among other reasons. It does not require the payment of relocation assistance or rent waiver. We're going to get into that further in regards to what the landlord's obligations are. And at fault reasons include non-payment of rent, nuisance, criminal activity, so on and so forth. A no fault termination is allowed when the tenant has not breached the lease and will require the landlord to pay 1 month's rent and relocation assistance, or grant the tenant a rent waiver for 1 month. No fault reasons for eviction include owner occupancy, withdrawal from the rental market, substantial remodeling, other things like that. We'll go over the exact details. So the just cause eviction rules only apply to tenants who have been continuously and lawfully occupying the property for 12 months. And then Debbie, you're asking what the current rate of inflation is. Excuse me. I'm going to get to that as a matter of fact. So you have an idea just what a landlord can do to increase rents or what the caps are, assuming they don't have it, they're not entitled to the exemption. And it's very interesting because when calculating the maximum amount that you can increase rents, assuming no exemption, it's based upon a cutoff date of August 1st of every year. So we'll have to address that. Nothing is ever that simple, unfortunately. So exemptions from the rent cap and just cause termination of tenancies. Single family properties and condos are exempt if the notice of exemption is provided to the tenants and the owner is not a real estate investment trust, a corporation, or an LLC in which one of the partners is a corporation. So to obtain the exemption, remember the rent cap and just cause of form must be made a part of the lease or rental agreement. So we'll talk about that also. And we'll talk about month-to-month tenancies, what can be done to incorporate that into the existing agreement. Other exemptions that include housing has been issued a certificate of occupancy within the previous 15 years, and that's a rolling 15 years. And then property containing two separate dwelling units, for example, a duplex, but the tenancy by the property owner must occur before the tenancy for the tenant and the other unit, and the occupancy by the landlord must continue to keep them exempt. So properties, unfortunately, in many cases, duplexes in which the owner's not occupying the property, the exemption is not available. So threeplex, fourplex exemptions are not available. And then let's move on to other things. The law does not apply to commercial property. The law does now apply to personal property mobile homes as of January 1st. Also, vacation rentals are exempted. So keep that in mind. We're seeing more and more vacation rentals. I don't know if anybody is representing anybody in this office with vacation rentals. We get questions about them, but I don't think we're providing any type of representation. And then the law does sunset 10 years after it was put into place, and that means January 1st of 2030. But you can probably bet that as of that point in time, it will be extended. Just like entitlement programs, they never go away, right? So what do you need, or what does your landlord need to provide tenants? The rent cap and just cause eviction form. So a couple of thoughts. If a landlord is asking you to renew a lease, or if they're asking you for advice on renewing a lease, don't allow them to just issue an addendum, because if that lease has been in place for 5 years, it's highly likely they have not given them the required statutory language, which allows the landlord to take advantage of the exemption. In all cases, if you're not sure, I suggest upon renewals using a current lease agreement and all the documents that are associated with that packet. I think it's going to be the most beneficial aspect for the landlord. And then most likely you should be assured that the RCJC is incorporated in the documentation. So if the rent cap and just cause eviction form wasn't provided, is the owner, did they give up or forfeit their rights? No, they didn't forfeit their rights. It just means that the notice, without the notice, the exemption is not available to them. And the tenant may have an affirmative defense against an eviction. But if the landlord hasn't raised rent beyond the permissible maximum or isn't attempting to evict the tenant without cause, then probably the landlord has not been affected negatively. Any questions about that? Got something in the chat box here. Gabby,
You need to, Rich, do you need to provide this form on every year you do a renewal?
If you provided in the past, no. But if you're unsure, and that's what seems to be the case, Sean, as I talked to various agents in the office and there are renewals coming up. landlords are not sure if they provided it. So if they're not sure, it's highly likely that they did, unless somebody like you was involved initially.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So if your tenant is month to month, doesn't matter. Certainly it does. So that the RCJC should be incorporated into the rental agreement by either having both the landlord and tenant signing it or providing the notice via change in terms of tenancy. And we'll go into the details of that also, about proper delivery. And then leases. Previously, the law allowed us to just send the RCJC as a notice. Now, if it's not incorporated into the lease at the time it's signed, theoretically, the tenant has no obligation to sign that RCJC because it would be an addendum to the lease. That would require mutual consent of both the tenant and the landlord for it to be incorporated into the existing lease. Let's see. And then Carlos, could you show us the RCJC, please? And then just scroll down to where the checkbox is. So he's kind of highlighting, but thank you, Carlos, the notice of exemption. If that box is checked, it's telling the tenant that the landlord is exempt from the rent cap and just cause law, or AB 1482. If it is not checked, then it's probably not clear and the landlord is not entitled to the exemption. So please be sure that the landlord checks that box. And the questions always come up once again, is the landlord entitled to the exemption? Well, we shouldn't be making that determination, but if it's an individual or a revocable family trust, most likely the landlord is entitled to the exemption. Remember, if it's a property that's 3 or 4 units or a duplex and the landlord's not occupying one of those units, the exemption is not available to them. So they're subject to the rent cap and just cause provisions of the law. So check the box if it's an exemption available to the landlord.
Richard, they're exempt. That means they can raise the rent up to 10%, correct?
They can raise the rent. There's no limitation unless there's a state of emergency in place issued by the state of California. We witnessed some of that in certain counties, as a matter of fact, during the last couple of years. Currently in Orange County and Los Angeles or San Diego, I'm not aware of a state of emergency that's currently intact or in place. So correct, Carlos, you're not limited in regards to the amount of the rent increase that you can impose upon somebody. So is it necessary for the tenant to sign the RCJC? If you're giving them a new lease and they refuse to sign it, it's a valid reason to terminate the tenancy. And if you're sending out the lease, obviously you're going to incorporate that, and that's part of the whole packet. And then can the RCJC be signed electronically? Well, if it's sent, so let's assume in this specific case, it's a new lease agreement and all parties are signing all documents electronically. Well, the rent cap and just cause addendum can be signed electronically by both parties. However, if it's a month-to-month tenancy, and we're seeing more and more month-to-month tenancies, there's 2 ways in which the RCJC can become effective. And one is via delivery of a notice of change in terms of tenancy. Carlos, if you go back to that document, please. Thank you. Let's go down farther. And then we'll reference the part in terms of the RCJC. There it is. All property, security deposit, rent cap, and just cause addendum. So let's assume we can do one of 2 things. The landlord can simply just ask the tenant to sign the RCJC, and maybe the tenant refuses to sign the RCJC, assuming it's a month-to-month tenancy. So what can the landlord do? Well, the landlord can attach the RCJC, it's the notice of change in terms of tenancy, send it to the tenant, and within 30 days upon delivery, and of course, it shows the method of delivery below in the lower portion form, it becomes effective. And why is that? Because the state law allows us to do that. Now, in this specific form, if you're delivering the RCJC attached to the notice of change in terms of tenancy, it must be hand signed by the landlord. Electronic signatures do not apply. So that's a big issue. We're using electronic signatures for everything. So a hand signature, I guess it could be as simple as emailing the document. They may have to print it and sign it, return it if you're going to be assisting in any way. And then
Question, Richard.
methods, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Does it state somewhere that it has to be signed? Because I hear this now, but in 3 months when I'm doing this, I will not remember that. So
On here, no, but the law states that, unfortunately. Any change in terms of the tenancies, or anytime a change is affected via notice of change in terms of tenancy, the law requires that it be hand signed, unfortunately. And we can't use a notice of change in terms of tenancy associated with a lease agreement, right? Because it's a valid contract. So we can't change that unilaterally by delivery of this. We can, if we were to have the consent of both parties, we can change the terms of the lease agreement. And not right now, we're just affecting a month-to-month tenancy. And Carlos, if you would scroll farther down so you can see the aspects or how it must be delivered. A little farther. So the form itself tells us what acceptable delivery is. So we've got to file or follow the details as prescribed here in terms of delivery for it to be effective. So unfortunately, electronic delivery is not a valid method of delivery. So once again, so the landlord can raise the rents. Let's assume they're not exempt. 5% of the lowest gross rent charged during the previous 12 months, plus the cost of living index. And Debbie, I'm almost to your question, as a matter of fact. And the 5%, well, adding to the 5% is the applicable consumer price index. Now, there are two different price indexes that we can base the rent increase on. And AB 1482 talks about the consumer price index for all urban consumers for all items. And there's two different price indexes. One includes food, energy, and everything. And then the other one excludes food and energy. Well, the index that we would be using includes food and energy, everything. So keep that in mind. And there's a publication issued by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics in regards to what that increase can be. And remember, we're limited to a cap of 5%, if we're not exempt, plus the CPI, and that's over the lowest base rent during that 12-month period. I'm not going to go over the areas in which there isn't a listed metropolitan area. I'm not going to worry about that, but the state of California does publish a schedule that one may use. I don't think we're probably working in any areas in which the schedule that's available to us through the US government isn't available. So if I'm increasing the rent in August, do I use the CPI from April of that year, from April of previous year? What's interesting, we have to, the CPI is adjusted every April. And now if we're going to be increasing rent prior to, let's say, August of this year, then we would be using the CPI as of April of 2021. And if it was prior to August of last year, we'd be using the CPI as of April of 2020. If we increase rent this year as of August 1st or later, we'll use the CPI index as of April of this year. And it's interesting, April of 2020, the amount was 0.7%. April of 2021, it's 3.6%. So right now, if I'm not exempt from the Tenant Protection Act, I can increase my rents by as much as 8.6%, 5% plus the CPI. So the dates, August 1st is a critical date on determining just what you can actually do in terms of rent increases. So Debbie, does that kind of address your question then? And there's a question, does this rent cap pertain to all types of properties, anything that's residential, 4 units and less? And who knows what April's CPI is going to be based upon what's taking place in the marketplace right now. And then the other aspect, when making a determination as to rents, must you round them? Yes, you round them up to the nearest 1/10%. So if the rent calculation is 6.25%, you would round it up to 6.3. If the rent calculation is 6.24, then the maximum would be 6.2%. That's the amount that you can then raise the rents. Any questions about that? And then remember, that's the maximum amount that we can increase rents for landlords who are not exempt is based upon the lowest gross rent during the last 12 months. So, any questions? And then let's see, and remember, it's based upon gross rents. And when we look at the car residential lease agreement, it is called gross rent, so it's easily determined, I'd say. And then what if an owner doesn't increase the rents during the last 12 months? Can they bank that rent increase? No, it's still within any 12-month period. It's capped during that period of time. And then how many times can a landlord increase the rents within a 12-month period? 2 times. That's it. Now, if a tenant is added, does the amount of the rents, can that be greater than the cap? And the answer is no, just the landlord's given an opportunity to raise the rents 2 more times during any 12-month period. If an additional tenant is added. Then vacancy decontrol, if you're not exempt and the tenant leaves, you're entitled to increase the rents to whatever the market rate rents are. And then what if I consider granting to my tenant a lower rent because I want them to waive their rights under the rent cap and just cause eviction law? Can they waive their rights? No, they can't do that. So if you reduce the rent thinking they're going to waive their rights, you're wrong, and they're going to get lower rent. And then in terms of rent increases, Carlos brought this up before. If you are exempt from the law, so you have to make first of all, you make the assumption nobody's exempt from the law unless they file the exemption. So the law applies to everybody. But if you are exempt, what is the amount that you can increase rent? Well, there is no limitation necessarily. However, it's the time frame that's applicable. And assuming there's no state of emergency in place, then a landlord who is exempt can increase, let's assume they're going to increase rents by 10% or less. A 30-day notice is required. If it's more than 10%, a 90-day notice is required to increase rents. Previously used to be 60 days for a rent increase in excess of 10%. And then let's assume that landlords are clever and they're not exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. Can they, within the lease agreement, structure a rent increase every 2, 3, or 4 months? Well, the answer is no, can't do that. And then let's talk about exemptions from the rent cap itself. So residential real property that is alienable separate, for example, a single family home or a condominium. So they're entitled to the exemption. Also, if the exemption is provided, the exemption is not available to the owner if they're a real estate investment trust, a corporation, or a limited liability company in which at least one member is a corporation. However, an exemption to that would be if the housing is age 15 years or less based upon the date of the issued certificate of occupancy, that property is exempt. And then, as I mentioned before, duplexes, assuming the owner occupies one of the 2 units prior to the occupancy taking place by the tenant in the other unit. If the owner moves out, the exemption is lost. Then also a housing restricted by deed for persons and families with low or very low income. Dormitories, that's another exemption from the Tenant Protection Act. So if you send your kids to college, they're subject to any rate increase that the landlord wishes. Very interesting, huh? Well,
Rick, apartment complexes are exempt too, right? Of 5 units or more.
exemptions don't exist for apartment complexes. It's more than one unit. It's not, they're not separate alienable units. And then I know we talked about the RCJC is a form special now, it's just the language within it that's required. So it's just statutory language that's included in the RCJC that assists us in regards to obtaining the exemption. So remember, a couple of questions that always come up if it's a month-to-month tenancy, how can you affect the exemption if you haven't done so? You can send the tenant a notice of change of terms of tenancy and attach that the RCJC. And it must be signed by the landlord and within 30 days following delivery. The delivery is defined in the notice of change in terms of tenancy, then it becomes effective. And the exemption would then be available to the landlord. Other than that, you should be including the RCJC when signing a new lease agreement, or if you decide to use an addendum, be sure that you include the RCJC if you're unsure that it was signed previously by the tenant and landlord. And we have some other things to talk about.
It must be signed by hand, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
And it must be signed in person.
Yes. Electronic signatures are not applicable when delivering a notice of change of tenancy and the attached RCJC. So both documents must be signed by hand. And then section 8 properties, it appears as if they're exempt from the law, but I wouldn't take any chances with that. And then if local laws are more restrictive than the Tenant Protection Act, then those supersede the Tenant Protection Act. Los Angeles has limitations on homes that were built before 1979 or 89. I'm not even sure what the date is. Let's see. And then in terms of evictions, if you're not exempt, you must provide one of the 15 reasons that fall within the just cause law itself in the event you're going to terminate a tenancy. And once again, if you're not exempt, if the property has been occupied for 12 months or more, you're subject to the just cause provisions. And then if you have a tenant that's been occupying the property for 10 months, say, can you evict them if it's a month-to-month tenancy? Yes, you can, and you're not subject to the just cause laws. And remember, it's lawfully occupying the property. So if they're occupying the property for 10 months and probably months 11 and 12 they're not paying, is that lawfully occupying the property? I would say no. So they would not fall within the provision of the just cause notice. And then the at-fault reasons for termination of tenancy. This is a simple one: non-payment of rent, a breach of a material term of the lease, using the property for unlawful purposes, criminal activity, refusal to allow entry, waste that means damage to the property, or signing or subletting the property, or let's see, or if you're going to be renewing a lease and the tenant refuses to sign the rent cap by just cause eviction form, that's a valid reason for terminating the tenancy. And then no fault evictions. If you're not exempt, owner occupancy, where the owner, the spouse, domestic partner, children, grandchildren, parents or grandparents of the owner decide to occupy the property. Substantial remodeling or demolition of the property, compliance with the government order to vacate the property. So, and keep in mind, if it's not an at-fault reason and the exemption is not applicable, you'll even see on the form that we have posted here, it indicates that if we're terminating the tenant, maybe it's not on this form, but when terminating the tenancy, it actually puts the tenant on notice that if it's not an at-fault termination of tenancy, they're entitled to 1 month's relocation assistance or 1 month's free rent. And if the landlord fails to honor those obligations, then the termination of tenancy is defective. You're gonna start all over again. And if you're not exempt, you must state one of the 15 reasons for termination of tenancy, by the way. So that's very, very important. And if you're exempt and you're terminating a tenancy, do you have to use one of the 15 reasons for termination of a tenancy? No, you don't have to give a reason for terminating a tenancy. So let's assume that we tell somebody that we're going to terminate the tenancy because a family member is moving in. Are we just being truthful, trying to get them out? Or is really somebody going to occupy the property? Well, if you're going to use that as a reason for terminating a tenancy and the exemption doesn't exist for you, and that means you're subject to the just cause laws, you should probably count on that person occupying that property for at least 6 months following termination of the tenancy. Remember, if you're exempt, you don't have to give a reason for terminating the tenancy. Withdrawing the property from the rental market. Once again, don't put it back on the market. I've had people suggest that to me. Well, we want to get them out. Let's just cancel or terminate the lease. And then a month or two down the road, we'll put it back on the market. Well, it's probably not a good idea. Remodeling, that's a valid reason if you're not exempt. Let's see. And then the relocation assistance. Assuming you're not exempt, the relocation assistance may be provided as a direct payment to the tenant within 15 calendar days of serving the termination notice. Otherwise, you must notify the tenant of the tenant's right to relocation assistance, or the owner can also notify the tenant writing that the payment of rent for the final month of the tenancy is waived prior to it becoming due. So those timeframes are very, very important to not cause the termination of the tenancy to become defective. Once again, if you don't, then the termination is void. And then, let's see. So I think I've covered most of the aspects that I wanted to address today. Does anyone have any questions that maybe I haven't answered? So just as a reminder, Assembly Bill 832 is applicable, and it's for rents owing between and including October 1st of last year through March 30th of this year. Odd date, March 30th, considering there's 31 days in March, I believe. So you can evict somebody based upon non-payment, but before filing an unlawful detainer action, it's an additional 20 days afforded the tenant, giving them the opportunity to apply for rental assistance and or the landlord assisting them with applying for rental assistance. So effectively, it's going to be a minimum 23 days from the date of delivery of the unlawful detainer action, from the notice of non-payment before you can initiate an unlawful detainer action. Now, if rents are owing still going back through September 30th of last year, remember, you can only evict based upon 25% of the rents owing. The other 75% is simply just a civil action that you can pursue the tenant for at that point in time. But there's no reason for the landlord to not pursue assisting the tenant with obtaining rental assistance. It's probably the best opportunity for them to recover any unpaid rents. Well, that's my discussion for the day. Anything anybody would like to add, even if it's not related to this discussion?
I had a quick question.
Sure.
So if like your tenant hasn't paid rent for like just a month or so, but now they've wanting to apply for the rental assistance from the government. And in order to file that paperwork, she has been paying cash to make sure there's no trail of check. Can we still apply to get rental assistance for the unpaid month? Or no?
Well, that's a good question. My experience with the state has been they want certainly documentation as to an existing lease agreement. So I would say even if the tenant is paid cash, that's not going to be precluded. So realistically, both the tenant and landlord are going to be attesting to the portion that has not been paid, but you're going to need a rental agreement. They're going to ask for documentation, probably as utility bills, things like that from the tenant to give the rental assistance program assurance that the tenant has indeed been occupying the property.
Okay.
So if the landlord's been collecting rent, in terms of cash, I would not in any way make an assertion that I haven't collected those rents. I would state the truth. I don't think it's worth it in terms of committing any type of fraud. And then if the tenant turns on you, who knows what will happen, right?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if basically if you're not been increasing the rent, this may be a way to catch up on the lost rent increase in this market.
Yeah, well, if they've been collecting some of the rent in cash, I guess that would be used in determining just what the amount owing is, correct?
Sounds okay.
I'm certain there must be fraud that's taking place in which both parties are probably stating, oh, I paid it, and the landlord may be saying to the tenant, yeah, you just sit there and state that you haven't received any money. Now, I actually even had somebody apply for rental assistance through me. It wasn't even a tenant of mine. I don't know how that.
How do you do that?
How did they do that? I don't know, but I was quick to tell the state of California that they're not my tenant and that's not my property. I was not going to get involved in something like that, but I was very surprised that something like that occurred, but I shouldn't be surprised.
Interesting.
Yeah. You think mistakes are happening? There's billions of dollars out there, so money's being spent improperly. Any other questions then?
Hey, I have a new
Do the tenants
listing.
do the tenants have to pay tax on any of that assistance?
I don't know. Here's what I can tell you. The recipient of the money is getting a 1099. So the landlord is getting a 1099. And then the money is distributed, by the way, in two ways. And this is why the landlord should be actively involved. The landlord can actually demand that the money be dispersed directly to the landlord, or if the landlord doesn't have involvement and it's just a tenant applying on behalf of the tenant's benefit, they can just simply state that, oh yeah, I'm going to pay the landlord. And I wonder how many of those tenants that do receive the rental assistance don't pay the landlord. And the landlord's options in terms of recovering the money from the tenant are no different than we discussed today. So the landlord should be actively involved. The money should be going directly to the landlord. And the landlord's going to be getting a 1099. But that's okay.
I got a question, Rich.
Yes.
So let me understand this. In the beginning of this, you said that you had a rental property of your own that was in arrear for rent with the tenant in there, and that there was rental assistance available to him, but you had to like burp him along the way to get it, and then the money came back to you from the rental assistance program. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But you did the work for him.
I initiated the entire process, correct.
Well, that doesn't surprise me, but I mean, but that's available. Was it available through the state?
It is.
Okay.
The Neighborhood Assistance Program, yes.
Okay.
And it's available to now the tenant's going to have to meet certain income restrictions. And I think it's based upon a median income in that area. But then if you have children, there's a formula which increases whatever that income limitation can be to make a determination whether they're eligible for rental assistance. So if someone's making $500,000 a year, they're not going to be eligible.
Okay. You know,
Go ahead.
it also, is there a program similar to that for mortgage assistance?
There may be. I'm just not familiar with it myself.
Okay, but the rental is definitely.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
sure. Okay. And there's one new message. Let's see. And then Debbie, I think I answered this, hopefully. But does the rent come directly to you or to the tenants? Well, if the landlord's actively involved, the landlord can stipulate they want the money paid directly to them once again. But if the landlord takes no involvement or has no involvement, then the tenant could simply say, pay the money to me and I promise you that I will pay the landlord. So the landlord's involvement, I think, is critical to be sure that the money is paid directly in the manner in which the landlord would like it to be paid. It could be a check, could be a wire also, by the way. It's based upon at the landlord's discretion.
Richard, can I ask you a question about CPI?
Sure.
When you look on Bureau of Labor and Statistics, they list data for each month. How do,
Yes.
does it state anywhere specifically that we must look at April date numbers?
Yeah, actually, because I think that they're using April of every year because they're claiming that it's republished, and it's not just necessarily the CPI. It's supposedly the change from the prior April to the current April. That is the amount of the additional rent that you can charge or assess somebody. And that once again,
Right, but April was chosen by whom, or where? How do we, let's say, in a month, how do we remember that it's an April date that we're looking at? Because they list data for each month.
right? Because that is the law that unfortunately we must follow. So it's just
Okay, so
yeah.
So okay,
It's just an arbitrary aspect of the law in terms of somehow
and
whoever
right,
compiled
sorry,
the
and you
language
mentioned
said-
August comes into play. How does August 1st come into play?
How does August come into play? Well, that's a good question, but what I can tell you, it's an arbitrary date selected within the Tenant Protection Act. So if in the event the rent increase is going to occur before August of that year, then you would look
Okay.
back at the change in the Consumer Price Index published by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics going back to the prior year. If it's August
Got it.
1st of a year or later, then you would be looking at the current year when making a determination of how much you can increase the rent. So if it's August 1st of this year, we would, or later, we would be looking at April of 2021. If we do it
Mhm.
now, we would be going back to April of 2020.
Got it. Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? And then when did the RC become effective? January 1st, 2020. Let's say John Barris, he has a new listing coming on the market next weekend. It's in Westminster. It's a 4-bedroom home listed at $950,000. You want to tell us a little bit, John?
Yeah, it's a 4-bedroom home listed at $950,000. We're shooting pictures this week, and it's actually a cute home. It has like a really good family feel to it, but I can't say that in the MLS. And it does not have a pool. It is It's fairly original, but everything works and it looks, it looks great. Like there's a yellow sink in it. In the
yellow
kitchen,
sink.
yellow sink and the green appliances in a bathroom. So it's, there's a lot of originality to it, but it is so clean. And it's a nice, comfortable 4-bedroom home with a fireplace, wood floors. And it's this backyard during COVID, they were bored. So they started painting the pavers and they painted them like all these really cool colors. And it's just a happy feel to it. And they said, should we paint them out? I said, hell no. I want everybody talking about, hey, look at the house with those painted pavers. So I said, whoever moves in, if they don't like it, they can change it.
Huh. And you're being asked for the address, John.
Yes. So the address is 5292 Cornell Avenue in Westminster.
What's
So
the
it's
square
very
footage,
wide
by the
street.
way?
I believe it's like 16 something. It's under 17, but over 1600.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's on a nice lot. So you can put a pool in the backyard without a problem. They just chose not to.
Wow. I didn't realize that area commanded that high of a price.
Well, I think I'm kind of a little low because I anticipate bidding the price up to probably right at $1 million.
Right. Wow. It's amazing.
Westminster is very hot right now.
Huh.
A lot of people are trying to grab properties to build ADUs, is my understanding.
I see.
Yep.
Well, large lots, you probably can.
Right.
Hey, once they sign the papers and close escrow, they can tear it down or do what they want to it.
John has an open mind. All right, great. Anything else anybody wants to share before we end the presentation today? No, okay. One thing I want to mention in regards to the clear cooperation policy. Remember, if you take a listing, be sure that you conform to the clear cooperation policy, meaning if you're not putting it on, registering, or if you're putting it on, be sure you do it in a timely manner because the fine is $2,500 and it's being effectively enforced. So please conform to that. If you have any questions about that, let us know. We'll help you and answer any questions that we can. So they're looking for your money. All right. Well, hey, well, thanks for attending, everybody. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.